Some events are impactful in the moment. Their legacy becomes clear over time, and seize control of FDA was both. October 11th, 1988, 30 years ago today. Welcome to the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health for an anniversary discussion of seize control of the FDA. My name is Joshua Sharfstein. I'm the Vice Dean of Public Health Practice and Community Engagement here at the school. The scenes that we showed from the protest, Seize Control FDA, were from the fantastic documentary, How to Survive a Plague. I'm really excited for the discussion that we're gonna have, and I'm just going to introduce it because we have some fantastic people, including some of the leaders of the protest, some of the soon-to-be leaders of the FDA, talking about that event, what it meant at the time, and its legacy for the future. I want to acknowledge Brett Gerard of Senator Van Hollen's office. Thank you so much for coming. And I want to thank all of you for attending and for watching online, and C-SPAN as well for the coverage. I also wanted to tell you that I am the author of a book that coincidentally I found here on the podium called The Public Health Crisis Survival Guide, which talks about crises that affected public health agencies at different points in history, including seize control of the FDA. And in putting together this book, I had the incredible opportunity to work with Mark Harrington, who is here today, one of the activists behind the protests and a real legend in the field of access to medications. I'm gonna read from what he wrote about this day in a sidebar in the book. On October 11th, 1988, ACT UP members from around the country made their way to the block-like FDA building. Perhaps 1,500 activists surrounded the building. Groups from each city and affinity groups from ACT UP New York clustered together in the street by the front entrance before a double row of county cops. Each group had its own visual signature, signs, and themes. 176 activists were arrested. The news coverage that evening was comprehensive and sympathetic. We were on all local stations, ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox, and CNN. Press coverage of the demonstration was overwhelming. We made the front page in Boston, Baltimore, Dallas, Houston, Orlando, and Miami, and were well covered in Atlanta, Buffalo, Chicago, Detroit, Los Angeles, Memphis, New York, Philadelphia, San Francisco, St. Louis, Tampa, Tucson, and Washington, D.C. USA Today ran a story on the front page of its third section. The tone of the coverage was favorable. AIDS activism had gone national. Among community newspapers, the coverage was euphoric. A turning point in the AIDS epidemic had been reached. In fighting for the rights of people with AIDS, some said, we were at the vanguard of a larger movement for patients' rights, a movement to revolutionize medical research for all diseases. And he quotes Kiki Mason, writing the New York Native, in the long war on AIDS, this past weekend may be remembered as Gettysburg. We still have much heartache and bloodshed ahead of us. We can take it. The tide has turned. Victory will be ours. So this was an extremely important protest. We're now going to hear from people who made it happen and talk about its legacy. And we're gonna do this in two panels. I'm gonna introduce the moderators and they will bring up the fantastic speakers. I'm gonna start by introducing Dr. Chris Beyrer, the inaugural Desmond M. Tutu Professor in Public Health and Human Rights at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. He is the founding director of the university's Center for Public Health and Human Rights. Dr. Beyrer.
Well, thanks so much, Josh, and wonderful, really wonderful to be here. We're going to have the first panel to talk about that time and that period. I'm going to introduce the panelists and ask them to come up in just a moment. But for those of us who were active and engaged at that time, it is an unforgettable period. For those of you, and I think many of our students will fit into this category, who either were not in the world yet or who were very young in 1988, it is hard to imagine what an extraordinary moment in time this was. It was the end of the Reagan presidency. The epidemic had been ravaging the country and increasingly the world for a number of years. The only drug, as you heard from that clip, was AZT. It wasn't working. A huge number of young people were dying and had this extraordinary sense of urgency about what needed to change. And of course, some of that needed to change was at the federal level. I think what marked ACT UP's extraordinary impact was several things. We're gonna talk about that. But I will just say that it was the passion, the commitment, the intensity, but also the smarts, the savvy, and really the extraordinarily skillful use of the tools of advocacy and activism to impact change. I must also just disclose before I go to introducing our panelists that my late partner and I were part of ACT UP New York when I was a medical student there, and then ACT UP Baltimore with Linda D. This event actually is a benefit for AIDS Action Baltimore, and there are still surviving members of ACT UP Baltimore in AIDS Action Baltimore. And as they say in South Africa, la luta continua, the struggle continues. So I'd like to first bring up Peter Staley and Ann Northrop. If you could join me in welcoming them. Peter is a long-term AIDS and gay rights activist, first as a member of ACT UP New York, and then he was one of the founding people of TAG, the Treatment Action Group, which was really the center of the scientific expertise within ACT UP. He's been on the board of AMFAR for many years, founded AIDSmeds.com, which is an educational website for people living with HIV. He's been a fellow at Harvard, at their Institute of Politics, and of course, he's one of the leading people in How to Survive a Plague. And Peter, that was you on the roof, isn't that? Peter's the guy on the roof as well. Ann Northrop is a journalist by trade and a longtime activist. She was in mainstream journalism before getting involved in ACT UP. She was at Ms., Good Morning America, CBS Morning News, and then she became an activist. In '87, she was working with the Hetrick Institute for Lesbian and Gay Youth, doing AIDS education to teenagers. She joined ACT UP in '88, which was very early on, eventually leading the meetings with hundreds of people. She was arrested more than 20 times, including a number of arrests and convictions for the actions in St. Patrick's Cathedral, the Stop the Church demonstrations. And very importantly, because the media is such an important part of this activism, she was one of the 3 designated spokespeople for the FDA protests. So we are really blessed and honored to have you both with us. Please join me in welcoming them.
Peter was my date for the St. Patrick's Cathedral, actually.
Yeah, we had to go in as couples.
Yes.
Yeah.
Catholic couples.
And I wonder if we shouldn't start, perhaps, by just going back to that time, to that fall, October of 1988, and I just ask you both to reflect on what it was like, what the sense of urgency, the challenges that you faced, and really what led to the decision to seize the FDA.
Well, it's first and foremost, it is worth underlining the fact that this was 7 years into the crisis, very late. The first cases of HIV/AIDS were in '81. There were some brave activists from the get-go. AIDS organizations formed early on, but as far as taking to the streets, it was sporadic. There was most of the national LGBT rights groups were a little frightened of playing an outside game, of rocking the boat, and focused on inside games. So it took a long time before Larry Kramer lit a spark, and a lot of anger and fear had built up by then. By '88, there was a lot of death and pain and suffering going on. And most everyone that joined the movement did it for very personal reasons. They knew someone, they had friends, they had lovers, or they themselves were HIV positive. And we formed in March of '87 after Larry's speech. And as that chapter description laid out, the FDA action was kind of our national coming out. And today is National Coming Out Day, actually.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
So
Something to celebrate.
So ACT UP had various chapters by that point around the country. We had made a big splash at the National March, Gay March on Washington, and the ACT UP New York chapter. And after that, all these chapters sprung up. And then a year later, we decided to target the federal branch that we thought was the most challenging as far as approving what we thought were meds just waiting to save us. So.
And you changed careers.
I did, and I want to put this in a little more political context because we have different experiences of that. I agree with Peter that a large portion of the membership of ACT UP was people personally affected by the epidemic who were there to save their lives. But at the same time, the group attracted many of us who came in from other movements, other experiences, who saw it in a more political context. It was the end of the Reagan years, a period of horror rivaled only by what we're going through today, of course. But I was older, and I had grown up watching the civil rights demonstrations in the South, people assaulted by fire hoses and police dogs. I had marched against the Vietnam War. I had worked in the feminist movement in the early 70s. And when I left CBS News and went to work at the Hetrick Martin Institute to do AIDS education to teenagers, something I never envisioned myself doing, I must say, I had covered the epidemic since the first cases in 1981 at these journalistic places, but when I went to Hetrick Martin in '87, I realized how little I knew. And it was a great immediate revelation to me. And what I found out was that the AIDS epidemic was exactly like the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, the feminist movement. It was about people in power who didn't care about anyone else and were only trying to maintain their positions of power. I call it the self-perpetuating hierarchy. And they were happy to have people die. They didn't care whether they sent them off to war or let them die at home and didn't do anything about it. That's what it was about. So that brought me to ACT UP very quickly, and it gave me an immediate sense of comfort in that room because it was full of angry, iconoclastic, smart people who were willing to get out in the streets and do something about it and have a voice that was not available in more institutional settings. So to me, that was what was going on at that moment. And ACT UP was so smart and so democratic and so able to figure things out with the whole group talking to each other that we identified the FDA as an important target because what we wanted more urgently than anything else was drugs. Effective drugs, drugs to save people's lives. And so we saw the FDA as a real stumbling block to that. One of the things that was said most often at that time was the federal government will go into urgent gear to solve Legionnaire's disease when 20 people have been affected. And here we have thousands, tens of thousands, ultimately millions of people with HIV, and they're doing nothing. So because of homophobia, because of this power differential, whatever. So that's what brought us to the FDA, and that's what was going on.
It was an extraordinary, organized, and thoughtful effort, and obviously I'd love to hear, Ann, your thoughts about the media strategy around it, because I think that's a very, very special piece. But Peter, maybe from your perspective, the policy issues, the things that you wanted to see change, that you called for. What was Seize the FDA that day about for you, for ACT UP?
We viewed it as this, first off, ACT UP's internal policy learning curve. We were still climbing it and had not quite reached the full knowledge that we would feel we had grasped a year or two later. And some of the initial issues, the month we were born in March of '87, AZT came out. There was a very political, angry reaction that a placebo had been used in the trial that brought that to approval. We did not want placebos used in future HIV drug trials. The press was filled with articles about various therapies that might protect CD4 cells, that might stop the virus. Some of them were approved overseas already for other uses. The buyers clubs had already launched in New York and other cities, importing some of these drugs like dextrans sulfate from Japan. I think the earliest part of the clip, you saw me in front of a board of pinned up dextrans sulfate, offering it for sale in front of the FDA. We were naive, in a sense, of thinking that drugs to extend our lives were just already out there and stuck, largely because of an entrenched government bureaucracy that had been doing its thing, its way for 20-some years, where it would take upwards of 5 to 10 years to get something approved and bring it to market, which we felt you shouldn't be doing for life-threatening diseases. So we wanted new regulations that would be very different than what they would use for nasal spray, and bring something to market much faster. Those were the demands, and fortunately for us, the FDA was already going a lot faster than usual by that point with HIV drugs, and they came out with most of those regulations that we were demanding in about a year to a year and a half after the demo. So they folded like a frightened deck of cards.
Well, I'm sure we'll hear from the next panel the other perspectives
yes,
on that.
I'm sure.
But I think the critical issue there, sort of thinking back on it, was essentially that people's perception was that the FDA was there to protect people, and it had a very elaborate array of protections. And in the context of all these young people dying with only one drug that wasn't effective, and high-dose AZT was worse than not effective for many people, that didn't seem to be the right paradigm at all.
Right.
Got to open up access, and that people were willing to take more risks. Right. And were less risk-averse than the agencies that were meant to be protecting them. That was very fundamental. The media strategy, we heard from Mark's read what a high impact it was, how effective it was. You were one of the people in front of the cameras.
Yeah, that impact was not an accident. That was very carefully planned and executed. Now, the whole point of an activist group like ACT UP is to affect change by public humiliation. The inside
shame and blame.
Yes, well, the inside strategy only goes so far. It's you need both. We certainly like the inside strategy too, but the point of an outside activist group is to shine a harsh spotlight on what we think needs to change or needs to be done. We've seen that recently with the Kavanaugh hearings and people all over Capitol Hill, many of whom, by the way, are ACT UP members who have taken their techniques and training to this current crisis. This is a long line from the civil rights movement through Vietnam, through feminism, through all these movements, and still active today. So these are eternal techniques. In terms of this FDA action, we had people coming in from around the country, from all over, and we made use of that. In what Mark wrote, you heard the list of all these places, all these newspapers from all over the country that covered this. Well, there was a reason for that. We set up a media strategy where we invited the national press. Believe me, no one was more surprised than us that they showed up. Delighted but surprised. And we had 3 designated people to speak at the podium. Vito Russo, who you saw a brief soundbite from, the legendary author of The Celluloid Closet, and just a fantastic guy who we lost some years ago. John Thomas from Dallas, also terrific, also gone, and me. And then what we did was we surveyed the members of our group and found people from as many states as we could find and lined them up just literally in a line near the podium where we were speaking and where the press was assembled. And when we got up to the podium, we each spoke a little, and then we said to the national press, over there is a line of people from these states, and they were each holding a sign of the state they were from. So you, members of the press, can go find someone from your home state to tell their personal story to your readers from your hometown and connect all of this locally. And the press just looked at us for a second like, what the hell is this? And then they just ran to that line of people. It was fantastic. And that is how we ended up not only all over the national news, which we did, but in all these hometown papers all over the country, because we had planned this to supply them with their local people.
Students, did you hear that? I wonder, in the remaining moments, we're gonna now turn to legacy and talk about the longer term impact. But in the immediate aftermath and in the months and weeks and months to follow, how did this protest and the response to it kind of shape ACT UP and shape what came next? It must have been something of a watershed event for the organization.
It was. I mean, I remember showing up at ACT UP's 3rd or 4th meeting after its first demonstration, and there was already over 100 people in the room. This is early in '87. And even then, I think the group knew that something special was happening, and we had the potential to make history. And it took a little over a year to build up that head of steam to break out nationally. And we realized we had done it on that day. I don't want to step on the impact group, but I do know that there's this, we were out to change hearts and minds. We were out to guilt trip the entire country that they were letting thousands of Americans die and the government was doing nothing. And if you look at this Gallup poll of America's level of homophobia that they've been running since 1977, it's an old question now of whether gay sex should be legal or illegal. It's kind of a sodomy question.
Watch out, the Supreme Court's coming to get us again.
I know. They've continued to ask it, and they still ask it every year because it's the longest span of polling they have on Americans' views on gays. And in 77, the country was kind of evenly divided on whether it should be legal or illegal, 46% each. And then with the AIDS epidemic, a backlash started that got really horrible, and the illegal line just kept rising and rising. It peaked in July of '88. This was after the quilt had been rolled out in Washington, so the quilt didn't turn the line around. It peaked at 57%, should be illegal. And then when they asked it again, after the FDA demo, after ACT UP became a national story, the movement of its time, and that got wrapped up in all this national press storyline of how the community had set up its own organizations and was taking care of its own, this beautiful community response. We were part of a larger AIDS story, but we we put it on the front burner. The next time they asked the poll, massive drop in homophobia, 21-point drop. That's a huge polling shift. And the lines, the illegal and the legal lines crossed. And we kept those crossed in the right direction for the next 5 years. And 3 years later, the NIH AIDS research budget had tripled and gone over $1 billion a year. And other disease groups were complaining about a powerful AIDS lobby that was getting more than its fair share. Right. That's what started on that day. And those tax dollars are the reason that I survived and millions are alive today, is that investment. So you can't overstate the impact of what happened 30 years ago today.
And by the way, those other disease organizations, once they got over their jealousy, silly terms in this context, learned and started using some of the same techniques. I sometimes poignantly and with heartbreak describe the silver lining of the AIDS epidemic as a phenomenon that did decrease homophobia because it forced a lot of people out of the closet. Particularly men in positions of power who had been hiding and couldn't hide anymore. And that made a lot of people in this country and around the world suddenly realize that they knew gay people who they hadn't realized they'd known before, and that had a major impact. But all of this activism, all this speaking up honestly, all this confronting power has continued and as I say, has certainly manifested itself in the last few weeks, and I hope will continue to manifest itself as we go forward.
I think that's maybe a beautiful way to wrap. Would you each like a moment to just maybe specifically address the students and talk a little bit about the sort of the power of activism in your personal story?
Sure. I mean, what I remember most from 30 years ago is being very scared. Before.
Well, you were on top of the overhang.
But going into that, my CD4 count had collapsed that year, and AZT I had tried, and it was too toxic, and I was on dextran sulfate from Japan, and that wasn't helping. And so I really felt the clock ticking, and I'd left I'd gone on disability and decided to spend whatever time I had left with this beautiful family that was becoming the movement of its time and had the potential to change the dynamics. And yeah, we were all in these affinity groups doing these beautiful visuals for the cameras, and I had been looking at that overhang. I had met Frank Young the month before to discuss our demands, and so I'd been in the building, and as soon as I walked in, that overhang was a target. And but
scouting.
There were about 100 cops underneath it, so
So if it had collapsed, no big deal? Is that what you're saying?
But the trick is that they were thinking horizontally and,
Yeah.
and not, they weren't, they just were protecting the doors. So I had two friends and the three of us walked straight towards the cops and they just stiffened up with their batons, but we were 5 feet away from them and right under the overhang. And they did a double hand clasp on either side of me, and I put my foot in it, and I was launched vertically, and the cops go, oh! I guess. And there I was over hanging a banner and getting the crowd rolling, and then they just left me up there, and I got really bored after a while. But Michelangelo Signorelli, who was head of the
media
committee,
operation, yeah.
he comes up and he yells at me, he said, "Peter, don't get arrested. We booked you on Crossfire tonight with Pat Buchanan." And so
One
I
of the only
negotiated,
good reasons not to get arrested.
I negotiated my way off the front. I didn't get arrested that day. So.
Yeah, we could basically pick our spots for that. And I just want to mention, as Peter said, the beautiful family. I had worked as a writer-producer at CBS News and other major news organizations, and I have to tell you that becoming an activist, working for a social service agency, so much more fun than working as a writer-producer at CBS News. Unbelievable. I spent a lot of time at CBS in my last year there calling my bosses intellectually bankrupt, and I think I was ahead of my time in doing that. But the joy of activism, to be able to spend your time thinking about real issues, real solutions, actions, working with people you admire and love. This action was 30 years ago. We all still know each other. We all still love each other. We're always happy to see each other. And I run into ACT UP colleagues around town, people I haven't seen for decades. I'm still thrilled to see them. And I just cannot overstate the gratification that you receive doing this work and being able to speak honestly. I remember one night at ACT UP, a government official came to talk to us to tell us that he really agreed with us and he really wanted to help us. And we just needed to understand that he couldn't step away from the government and say any of this honestly because, you know, he had to keep his job. And we looked at him and we said, yes, we hear you. We appreciate your support. We get it. But what you have to understand is we don't care about your job. We care that you speak out honestly about what's going on. And that should be your highest priority. And that's what we have found in doing this, and it has made for a very happy life. I am enormously satisfied to have walked away from the mainstream news. I now do a weekly TV show called Gay USA, which you can all look up and watch, which is just a nonsense little cable show, but it turns out it's available worldwide, and people watch it worldwide, and we get to speak up there too. So it's really the relationships and the ability to fulfill your desire to tell the truth that stays with me.
Well, I want to thank you both for your activism then, and for your ongoing engagement in activism, and also I want to ask everyone to join me in thanking these marvelous people.
Wow, thank you very, very much. Seize control of the FDA was a remarkable protest, but it was more than a protest because it was a protest that caused a crisis. And it was a crisis for the FDA, a crisis for the medical establishment, and that crisis led to change. It wasn't preordained that if you just booked buses and went to the FDA that you would have these effects. It was really the strategy that you just heard about from Peter and Anne and the work that some of the people on the next panel did that made it more than just a protest and turned it into the kind of crisis that led to major improvements and advances that paved the way for rapid approval of really important therapies for HIV and other diseases. And how the crisis led to that change and the context for that change and the people who were able to use the crisis in a way to propel that change forward is the subject of our next panel. And this is also a great panel. Let me, right before I introduce it, just say that it is true that this is also a benefit for AIDS Action Baltimore. Afterwards, people will have a chance to meet the speakers and also buy a book we just happen to have a little poster of right here called The Public Health Crisis Survival Guide that does have a chapter on this protest and its aftermath. And the benefits from that will go to AIDS Action Baltimore. So for this next fantastic panel, which includes, I should just say, David Kessler, who gave me one of my very first jobs in public health. I've always been a huge admirer and fan of his, as well as Mark Harrington, Greg Gonzalez, who is just a fantastic leader in his field today, and Susan Ellenberg, who all these people will be more formally introduced, but not only is a brilliant statistician, but has been a friend of our families for a long time. So it's really going to be fantastic to talk the next step about what caused that change and the legacy of this protest. And to lead this discussion, I'm going to ask Dr. Jeremy Greene to come up. Dr. Greene is a professor of medicine and the history of medicine and the Elizabeth Treide and McGehee Harvey Chair in the History of Medicine here at Johns Hopkins. Thank you so much, Jeremy.
Thanks so much, Josh. And it's such a pleasure to be here at this event, what a pleasure it was to get to experience that last panel. As a historian of medicine, I want to attest again to the fragility and the importance of living history and how much we should attend to those who remember moments that slip away from us in some ways, even as much as they leave enduring trails in the history of activism and public health. And I notice this in teaching my own undergraduates and medical students that as I get older as a teacher, the historical memory that I can assume from an incoming student slips away. What the AIDS epidemic was, what the experience, what the signifiers were change with generations. And I just want to point out as well that what we're celebrating today helps to reinforce a certain resonance. I think this came across in the last panel, a resonance of the importance of attending to civil disobedience as a form of public health practice and as a form of democratic participation. And this is as true today as it was 30 years ago. And I know that our next panel will offer us new perspectives to approach that question. I want to say that our second panel will look downstream from the event itself and ask, how did it change the FDA? How did it change AIDS? How did it change public health practice and health policy? How did it change the nature of grassroots activism in America and around the world? And we have an extraordinary group of panelists, as Josh suggested. I'm really, truly humbled to share the stage with them. And I will like to introduce our panelists first, ask them all each to speak for about 5 minutes or so, and then look forward to a discussion all together. And again, we won't be taking questions from the audience today, but there will be time at the reception afterwards. So first, I'll announce in alphabetical order. And as I mentioned, if you could come up and join us, actually all four of us, if you could come join at the table. Dr. Susan Ellenberg is professor of biostatistics in Perelman School of Medicine in the University of Pennsylvania. Her research has focused on practical problems and ethical issues in designing, conducting, and analyzing data from clinical trials. Among her many duties at Penn, she serves as senior statistician for several multi-center clinical trials, directs the biostatistics core of the Penn Center for AIDS Research, and chairs the organizing committee for annual Penn conferences on statistical issues in clinical trials. And prior to her appointment at Penn, Dr. Ellenberg was director of the Office of Biostatistics and Epidemiology in the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, or CBER, at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, and as the first chief of the Biostatistics Research Branch in the Division of AIDS at the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease. Greg Gonzalez is an AIDS activist and epidemiologist who teaches at Yale School of Public Health and the Yale Law School, where he also co-directs the Global Health Justice Partnership. He was a member of ACT UP Boston, ACT UP New York, and co-founded the Treatment Action Group and the International Treatment Preparedness Coalition. He received his bachelor's in ecological and evolutionary biology from Yale in 2011, his PhD in public health from Yale in 2017, and Greg did not put this on his bio today, but some of you may have noticed that he received a Genius Award from the MacArthur Foundation just last week in recognition of his work at the intersection of human rights and public health practice and research. Mark Harrington has also received a MacArthur Genius Award for his work in these fields. He was born and raised in San Francisco, graduated from college in 1983, a member of ACT UP New York from 1988 to 1992, helped lead ACT UP seize control of the FDA action in 1988, and to storm the NIH in 1990. And along with colleagues from ACT UP's Treatment and Data, or T&D Committee, he co-founded the Treatment Action Group in 1992, and he's been executive director of TAG since 2002 and co-chaired the data work group of the New York State Ending the Epidemic Task Force in 2014-2015, and is also a member of the TB Science Group of the AIDS Clinical Trials Group. He has been living with HIV since 1985 on combination antiretroviral therapy since 96 and was awarded this MacArthur Foundation Fellowship in 1997, and he lives and works in New York. And finally, David Kessler is trained as a pediatrician and lawyer, served as the commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration from 1990 to 1997. Dr. Kessler then left the FDA to join the Yale School of Medicine as its dean from 1997 to 2003, and then served as a post of dean and vice chancellor at the University of California, San Francisco Medical School. And among his many other honors, he was awarded the Public Welfare Medal from the National Academy of Sciences in 2001. And since you've all arrayed yourself in a line, I'm going to ask each of you to speak for 5 minutes or so, and to ask specifically to reflect on the legacies of that day, now 30 years ago today, both immediately for ACT UP, for the FDA, and the broader communities of patients, family members, advocates, healthcare workers, and scientists brought together in the AIDS crisis, and more broadly for legacies of activism, advocacy, and public health afterwards. And Mark, since you're on this end, I'd love to ask you to start first and then just go down in order.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the organizers for putting together this, this great commemoration. I can't help but thinking about the Reagan years as the beginning of a long national and international nightmare that we're still living through. It was a continuation of the war on drugs that had begun in the 60s and the 70s. And when I think about what the AIDS epidemic represented in the 80s when I moved to New York and became involved in ACT UP, and I think about all the other communities in New York that had already been suffering from centuries of racism, from the prison industrial complex, from the war against drugs, at that point the disestablishment of asylums and the release of mentally ill people with no community care, the crack epidemic, the opiate epidemic, all of these things were layered across our communities in our city in a way that if you go to New York now, and they're still actually there, but they're not as visible in some ways. And yet, these are all pieces of national unfinished business that we have yet to address. And we are all part of a much greater set of movements for social justice and public health and human dignity. And so the role of ACT UP within that framework was to catalyze, we recognize that a whole lot of social injustices came through and were evoked in the suffering that AIDS caused. And yet there was only a few hundred of us that were active in ACT UP New York and a few thousand around the country, and there was no way we were going to be able to, like, say, achieve national health care or end the war on drugs or overthrow the legacy of racism and violence. And yet, ACT UP made efforts against each of those areas. I mean, if you think about the pioneering work that the Needle Exchange Group did and how it led to harm reduction and strategies that are being used all over the world for battling opioid addiction and for helping drug users reintegrate into society, that was one thing that came out of ACT UP. Housing. Continued activism on housing is one thing that came out of ACT UP. And so what we're here to talk about today is just one tiny piece of a giant mosaic of beautiful social change work that ACT UP took part in, contributed to, and then many organizations spun out of to continue doing work in those various areas. And as Ann said before, I think that work is incredibly relevant now. We're facing political challenges that are very reminiscent of what happened in the 80s. And even though people might like to sort of think that the 80s weren't as bad, I mean, one of the reasons that we were able to get money for AIDS research was because the Democrats were in Congress, and that's not the case now. So what were the legacies of the FDA action in particular? I think you can see it as it triggered an unfolding of incredible institutional creativity and an alliance between activists and scientists that reshaped the way that medical research was conducted, particularly for infectious diseases and particularly for HIV infection. And it led to a series of breakthroughs like the parallel track, expanded access to medications that weren't approved yet but that had promise, that reached tens of thousands of people between 1989 and 1992. It led to accelerated approval, which David down on my panel was the author of, which would allow you to approve drugs based on a surrogate marker. At first, the drugs were approved on a surrogate marker that didn't work, CD4. And then later, because of scientific technology, we got viral load by 95, and suddenly we had triple combination therapy in 96. And the same kind of pressure that ACT UP put on the FDA, they put on industry, and they put on the National Institutes of Health to change the way that clinical trials were done. And allies like Susan Ellenberg were absolutely critical in forming a statistical sort of activist coalition to figure out newer, smarter ways of doing clinical trials. And then I think the final part of the unfolding of what happened as a result of the FDA was that we got HART earlier than we would have otherwise. And then there's people like Greg who made an amazing contribution in helping to share those lessons about the development of HART with activists in South Africa and around the world through the International Treatment Preparedness Coalition. And so from that one spark of ACT UP and the FDA action came a movement that now has resulted in over 40 drugs being approved for the treatment of HIV and the treatment of over 20 million people today with antiretrovirals. And those are just a few of the things that came out of that demo 30 years ago today.
Thanks, Mark. Susan?
So I listened to Ann with great interest. I was nothing like Ann. I was never an activist. I had sympathy for a lot of movements. I never went to a march. I never even had written a letter to the editor. And I joined the Division of AIDS after working for several years in the National Cancer Institute a few months before the action at the FDA. And I had some moments of wondering what I had gotten myself into. I was a strong advocate of rigorous research, clinical trials. That was my area. And the people that I was working with within the NIH and the outside, the investigators, the clinical investigators, who were clearly very dedicated to this work, we were all pretty fearful of what this group was going to do. We felt that it wanted to turn the research paradigm upside down. And as you saw in that clip, and there were certainly a lot of people who felt that way, just give us the drugs. Just, any of you saw the movie The Dallas Buyers Club, put the drugs out there, and somehow we should be able to try them. So I was not really prepared to engage with this. But then a year later, I went to the International AIDS Conference in Montreal in 1989, and ACT UP was there, and they still looked pretty scary to me. I mean, they didn't look like people who were going to listen to me at all, but they were giving out sort of mimeographed sheets with something called the ACT UP Treatment Research Agenda. And so I, surreptitiously grabbed a copy and ran off to look at it, was a little afraid of what I was going to find. And what I found was that almost everything in there was about as sensible as you could get in this situation. It wasn't, crazy demands. What this group wanted was clear to me was efficient but humane research, and most of the things that they were calling for to make trials more humane, there was no reason we couldn't do the trials. That way it just was a little different from the way people had proceeded. And so I brought this back and circulated around to some of my statistical colleagues, and we had some discussions, and I will tell you, everybody was very excited. It turned everybody in that room into an activist. From that minute, I was an activist. 2 members of ACT UP came to that meeting. I don't know how they found out we were talking about this because we didn't circulate it to anybody from ACT UP, but they came, and while they kind of tried to be a little bit fierce and, like they had been at the rally, it was clear that, their heart was really in the right place. There was lots of enthusiasm. We scheduled another meeting quickly. At the next meeting, we had twice as many people there. The meeting after that, we had twice as many people. Pretty soon, we had about 100 people coming to these meetings. Some of the clinical people started to trickle in. In the meantime, I was facing my own sort of activism within the government because most of the clinicians within the NIH were still very resistant to opening up to the activists. They were still confident that they just wanted to overturn everything, whereas I could see that what they wanted was good research that was going to give the right answers, but maybe more efficiently than we had been able to do it. So I remember at one point, when the AIDS clinical trials group was still closed to the activists, but the statisticians were meeting with them, we had a retreat in the Division of AIDS, and I went to the retreat wearing an ACT UP sweatshirt. It was not well received by our division director, but I did turn into an activist, and was very pleased with how things went. I think the FDA was listening, and gradually the rest of the clinical community started to listen too. And I think the accelerated approval regulations that got put in place, it was sensible. I think this was the best model of activism that you could possibly have, and not all activism is the same. Not everybody has been like the ACT UP group that really learned about how to, or was really interested in learning about, how to do things the right way, but do things a faster way.
David?
In 1988, I'm a pediatrician in the Bronx, and I'm teaching at Columbia, and I invite Frank Young, who was commissioner of the FDA at the time. This sees the FDA action was taking place, and I must have invited him a few months after that. And my recollection is he gets up at the podium, and the first thing he says is, just stand, for your own safety, stand clear of me. And he thumped on his bulletproof vest. I don't know why I took the job following Frank Young, but I never wore a bulletproof vest. The narrative, and you have to understand, I mean, I love these guys, but the narrative that sees the FDA have the protest, and FDA a year later, 2 years later, folded, and everything was fine. Maybe we should keep that narrative. There's something glorious about that, but I'm not sure that's the whole story. Because in the end, this was about, from my point of view, when we got to the FDA, this was about finding drugs that worked. This was about the science and coming up with the right policies, right? This wasn't about, I mean, I never for the moment felt that the FDA was under siege. I did feel there was a public health crisis of enormous proportions. And I remember several key, pieces early on that I think that helped. First, you have to build, policy really makes a difference. Policy makes an enormous difference, and I hope you show you just in a moment why. But, the really great, true legislator, great, Edward Kennedy, back in, even before 1979, had come up with an idea about conditional drug approval. And it's true, AZT was done as a full-blown clinical trial. It was 107 days, if I remember, on drug, and there was a placebo group. And we can argue whether that was in the public interest, right? Because in 107 days, we got an answer, at least whether the drug worked. But that was based on survival as the endpoint. Senator Kennedy had this idea about, can you condition approval on a drug based on more limited data? And he proposed that in '79, and it didn't go anywhere. And I remember when I got to the agency, that idea had stuck with me. And I went to Bob Temple, who's a national resource in the Center for Drugs, who knows more about drug regulation than anyone in this country. And I said, you know, the average approval time was at that time, not just for AIDS drugs, but for any drugs, was about 30 months. And I said, that's too long. I mean, is there something here in conditional approval that we can do? And Bob, you have to know, when you're a commissioner, you have certain influence, but there's enormous resources that you have to bring along. And Bob went and thought about it and said, yes, if we can create a policy that if you can show an effect on a surrogate endpoint, and you validate that surrogate endpoint as being predictive of that clinical endpoint, we could approve a drug based on that surrogate endpoint, and then require a confirmatory evidence later, right? So I got Bob then Bob became the advocate for what was named conditional approval. I mean, we took it, we put it in the federal register. We changed the name because we knew assurance companies would use conditional approval as a way not to pay for something, so we called it accelerated approval. But then we needed the data. Phil Pizzo was at the NIH studying DDI in pediatric populations. And I remember having a meeting with my friend Tony Fauci. He sat at one side. It was a formal meeting. At one side of the table was Tony, and I was sitting on the other, and we both had our staffs. I remember at the end of that meeting saying, we needed, I remember getting on the phone with the CEO of Bristol Myers Squibb and said, we need your data on DDI. Because he was working with Phil Pizzo, we needed that data. Because in that data, Bristol Myers Squibb didn't understand. It had data to, quote, validate, again, it wasn't a great marker, but CD4 as correlated with outcome. What you didn't hear in the first panel was, the real success was that the activists came to the table and learned the science as well as the scientists. And together, we worked through a series of drugs to see which ones really worked. We were willing to take certain risks based on, trying to validate surrogate markers. And by 1995, we set out this policy and said to the drug industry, hey, if you could show an effect on a surrogate marker, we'll approve that drug within days or weeks, not months. And that policy, it's amazing. You come up with a policy, and the industry actually followed it. And they followed it to the T. And then within several weeks, 3 protease inhibitors got approved. I will save if we can talk about the follow-up meeting when ACT UP came in for part 2, or maybe later. But policy makes a difference, science makes a difference. Activism had its role, but that's not what drove, in the end, the piece of you need the data, you need the science, you need the policy.
Greg?
So as our old friend Jane Silver used to say, I hate to be the skunk at the garden party, but there's a little bit of triumphalism about the story, which I don't think is true. The history of the FDA, as many people in this room know, was based on tragedy. The elaboration of its powers and its authority was based on the vaccine contamination. Jeremy knows all these stories very well. decade after decade of tragedies that led to increasing scope of the agency's powers. Industry hated this. Industry hated this. In the early 60s, when the Kefauver amendments were passed that said that efficacy had to be part of the FDA's powers and authority in addition to safety, they said, oh, this is going to destroy innovation, and then and kept this drumbeat up for many, many years. But the agency sort of lumbered along with its new authority under the Kefauver amendments until we arrived. And we said the FDA is killing us, right? And in a certain sense, we wanted these drugs out on the market faster, and we wanted smart trials, we wanted humane trials, we wanted access and answers, but somebody else was listening. And this brings us to the current historical moment, because it's the people who are in power now, and who've been sort of enemies of the regulatory state since the Reagan administration, who think the FDA should be small enough to strangle it in the bathtub. And we've seen, and this is not under the Trump administration, there's a bill called the 21st Century Cures that passed last year under the Obama administration, signed by President Obama back in last month in office, and basically takes all the reforms we asked for and pushes it to the furthest extreme, right? And so we see shorter trials, smaller trials, less and less information about the drugs we put in our bodies that cost more and more and more and more, right? And so we opened up a Pandora's box back then because we were desperate. There were people from the Manhattan Institute and other right-wing think tanks, like the Goldwater Institute has the Right to Try bill. The Right to Try is nothing like parallel track, where we asked for clinical research to be ongoing as we made drugs available to people who didn't qualify for the clinical trials or lived too far away from them to be part of them. Right to Try opens up the floodgates to unproven quack remedies to be put out into the market and given to patients without any sort of recourse, and no legal recourse if they're harmed. So we did lots of great things, but there were other people listening in the corporate world, in libertarian think tanks and right-wing think tanks, and we dodged some of the bullets around with this current FDA commissioner. We could have had one of Peter Thiel's acolytes who said, we don't even need an FDA, the markets can decide these things. But we're in a very, very dangerous moment, and I think Anne's discussion about how this is part of a struggle that reaches back into our history, but it also reaches forward. And I want new drugs out there as fast as possible, but I don't want to sacrifice the evidence. We need to know how they work, right? And I think part of the danger of the moment of seize the FDA is that we operated on false premises. Peter was saying our learning curve was steep. By the time we got to D4T, I was on the D4T panel at FDA, and I voted against it, right? You know, and then protease inhibitors came about, and we all sort of relaxed a bit because we finally had drugs that really worked and were clearly effective. But by that time, FDAMA, 21st Century Cures, all these sort of legislative proposals came through that sort of kept pushing the envelope, faster, faster, less evidence, less rigorous. And now we're at a place which, you know, Sarepta has a drug for Duchenne's muscular dystrophy that was approved about a year ago. 12 patients, unrandomized study on unvalidated surrogate markers. And Janet Woodcock at the FDA, who I have great respect for, made a heartfelt case for why they did the right thing. I think they did the wrong thing, and it's actually, as an AIDS activist and somebody who lived through these years, I think it's going backwards for the FDA when FDA had made so much progress.
But you changed the course of an epidemic.
Yes, but we did that, but...
Fine,
but,
just as long as you understand that.
I know.
Okay.
I'm morose, I'm sorry.
Well, there's many reasons to be morose, but I'm also delighted at the diversity of opinions that are already on display, even in this beginning, because that's good history. And I also think it's important to actually sketch out these differences in how we remember the past. I want to think for a moment, Greg, you've left us on a note of considering some of the unintended consequences of this action and engagement, in which the terms of engagement have been distorted to something which AIDS activists themselves would not recognize, even though they are being used in the same terms. And I'm wondering if the rest of you would comment on intended and unintended consequences of this engagement as well.
Well, I think one really good example is the COX-2 inhibitors, where we had a class of new painkillers that were supposedly safer than aspirin. And they were all validated based on a surrogate marker, which was that people said that they didn't hurt as bad. And they never ran out the trials to see what were the long-term effects of being on a COX-2 inhibitor, and it turned out a bunch of people died because they had bad cardiovascular effects. And I don't even think they used the accelerated approval mechanism. I think they used a full approval mechanism with an inadequate endpoint, and hundreds of thousands of people had effects from that. And there's many other classes of drugs where not even accelerated approval, but just the pressure the FDA is under to approve rapidly when there's a multi-$100 million industry investment. Sometimes, if you can change the thought leaders in a field, you can often change the field without actually having the science that's required. And one of the good things about the sort of the public nature of AIDS research and the fact that there's community involvement in every layer of the research and that there's public and informed community expertise, as well as providers and non-drug company researchers like federally funded researchers at the ACTG and elsewhere, means that AIDS research is handled in a very transparent fashion. And if there's debates about endpoints, or there's been debates about endpoints all along, I mean, just look at the PrEP trials or the treatment as prevention trials, or how long it took to get treatment for all because it required randomized controlled trials to say start and treat everybody, even though Tony Fauci and the people who led the ACTG said we could never do such a trial. And then suddenly such a trial was done, and then global guidelines were changed, and now we end up having treatment for all because we have randomized, rigorous proof, and that was forced by the activists and also by World Health Organization and developing countries wouldn't adopt HARP for all unless there was evidence from an RCT. So that's a virtuous ecosystem that was created within AIDS research. A lot of other disease areas don't have that, and millions of people suffer because drugs get approved on inadequate evidence.
You can almost say it's the American way, right? Because, I mean, the mantra is the following, right? I want access to now, and the government shouldn't be involved and not stand in the way. But if something goes wrong, I can assure you the same people who are saying that are going to say, where was the FDA? Right? So I'm going to test your memories for a second. I remember a meeting. It didn't look like the video that we saw, but it was a meeting in my office, in my conference room, maybe 94, 95?
July 94.
July 94, okay? So we're going to see this is, and I remember it was a group of activists, some at the table, right? Some in the audience came in to see me. You want to say what? See if what was that? What's your memory of that meeting?
We told you not to approve sequinavir based on a phase 2B study that had 225 patients in it that didn't have enough sample size to show whether the drug was any good, when we already knew that 96% of the drug was excreted in your urine, and we were worried that the dose was suboptimal, and we wanted larger trials of sequinavir before you approved it, and the industry went out and doubled the sample size and did the trials.
So let me translate. So basically, the message was the following, right? Would you stop approving these drugs so quickly? We don't have data on dose. We don't have data on combination. We don't know how to use these drugs. And would you hold the industry's feet to the fire so we get the data? Did I get the message right?
Mm-hmm. And double the sample size.
And double the sample size. They wanted the data. Those were the same activists, right?
A little chastened by reality after the first 5 nucleosides came out, and the number of deaths from AIDS kept going up relentlessly, and there was no scientific validation for combination therapy at that point.
But it's also fair to say, and I never fully understood, I was just, my head was down, I was trying to get the data, I was trying to get the drugs, I was trying to get the policies through, but the activist community was not of one mind, right? Being fair?
Yeah.
I mean, in some ways, I couldn't even keep, there were arguments within the activist community that,
So I remember another FDA meeting where Marty Delaney and I think, were on the panel, and David was sitting somewhere on the U-shaped table, but we were screaming at each other, East Coast against West Coast.
Not against FDA.
Not against FDA, because Marty, who's no longer with us, was that, why are you guys talking about needing more evidence? We can get the drugs out there and we'll figure out how they work. I mean, maybe it's a little bit crude approximation of what Marty's views were, but we were saying, no, we want access and answers. And I don't know, I was telling this to David earlier, I think there's a little bit of a libertarian streak in Marty that had more of a faith in the ability to figure it out later, where we felt burned by AZT, DDI, D4T, DDC, and we assumed that the next generation of drugs were going to be to provide marginal improvement. Mark will always tell the story that I said, you know, what does the future hold for us? I said, we're all going to be dead. I mean, I really didn't feel like the protease inhibitor was going to make a huge impact for us. So we were pessimistic, but we thought we could balance access and answers. You know, we had very, very serious fights with our West Coast colleagues about what that balance should look like.
Can I just, but the answer, you know, to, has the pendulum swung too far today? Right? The history of FDA regulation is always this pendulum. Right? But the pendulum tends to correct, right? But you're right, sometimes people get hurt until that pendulum you know, swings back. So yes, it always will overreact a little, it will swing back when something happens. But the thing that gives me confidence is the thing that there is a group, day in and day out, of the Susan Ellenbergers or the Josh Sharfsteins or the Bob Temples, I mean, who are not in the spotlight. Sometimes they're just called the federal bureaucracy, that care about the public health mission. And they get pounded, right, from all sides. But as long as the, you know, people are willing to serve and take that heat and be well-trained and take on these difficult jobs for relatively little in financial reward, we have some hope that those pendulums don't swing too far and always readjust.
Susan.
Over the last 20 years, there's been a series of legislative acts aimed at least for some part of it, to get the FDA to move faster. All right, we had FDAMA, and we had FDASIA, and we had FDA, and the 21st Century Cure Act is just the latest in all of these, and they all had components of, you know, how can the FDA make things go faster? When can we get by with only a single trial? When can we get by with, you know, with marker data? When can we do this? When can we do that? But you know, I think the FDA takes these, you know, legislations and these acts, and they figure out how they're going to deal with it. And for the most part, I think they have been able to maintain, you know, strong science. Bob Temple's still at the FDA. Yeah. I think he's still exerting an influence. I think he's still regarded in the way you did, Dr. Kessler, when you were there. Of course, he won't be there forever, but I do think that as long as we don't have a bureaucracy that's totally destroyed by any kind of administration that would like to do away with all regulation, I feel pretty comfortable that we're not going to get too far. That pendulum is not going to swing too far.
So I mean, I think these are always metaphors of history. When is history a pendulum? When is it a cycle? When is it a straight line going up? When is it a straight line going down? And I think that as we consider the legacies of this moment, right? I think we can, all of these frames have already come into this discussion. What I would like to ask you, as you think about the way that science and activism are co-located in this discussion, right? Because David, you specifically mentioned what happened here is activists came to the table and learned science. Susan, you mentioned the story in which you, as a scientist, didn't think you were an activist, and then at some point find yourself wearing ACT UP sweatshirts. And so how is that interaction, and in some level, the role of a science-based regulator that is accountable to its publics, right? Something that either, David, as you suggest earlier, may not have been inflected by civil disobedience as the glorious narrative gives it, or Mark and Greg, as you've told in your narrative, really required civil disobedience, and actually that engagement between science and the publics that it's responsible to just requires forceful intervention by those stakeholders that are involved and must be heard. How do you think these complications work out in the way that we think of grassroots activism today and its continuing role in engaging with public science?
Hard problems get solved by people who are willing to step up to the plate. Policies and drugs, they don't happen just anonymously. It's because people dedicate their lives to making those things, to finding effective drugs or finding the right policies. I mean, there's going to be a student in the audience today who's going to come up with a new way to do clinical trials that will advance that field, right? There will be a regulator, right, who sees a signal in certain data, in certain clinical trials, and by looking at that signal and following that signal will be able to save thousands of lives because they'll raise their hand. And there's, I mean, members of Congress, they create these legislations, some are better than others, but in general, they want to advance, they want to help people for the most part, right? But look, we still have a private system of drug development, and we have to recognize that. Yes, the NIH can play a role, right? But it's still pharmaceutical companies who are funding this. And we have to recognize that that too is part of the system.
Mark?
We need publicly funded drug companies so that we can address the diseases of the poor. We need a right to science so that people's health needs get the appropriate investment in health research and social science research to address the disparities that continue to afflict and deform our world. If there's one thing we learned from AIDS activism, it's that political will can be generated by a constituency. But if you look at a disease like tuberculosis, which has been treatable and curable since before I was born, and we've had an effective pre-exposure and post-exposure prophylaxis for that disease in the form of isoniazid preventive therapy also since I was born, and the fact that it's not being used around the world, and there's researchers in this room like Dick Chasen who are trying to figure out ways to make that happen in a month instead of in 9 months or 12 months, and yet there's no funding for the kind of research that we need to accelerate progress in preventing and treating this leading infectious killer of people around the world, shows that we've got a lot of work to do in terms of just the social justice within biomedical research. And so for every AIDS trial that's done, there's like 1/20th of the 5% is done for TB, and yet TB is killing more people. So we're not doing a good job of mobilizing the resources that are necessary, and we do need public health research. Brazil has a public drug company. Why don't we have public drug companies to make generic drugs when predators come along to raise the price of pyrimethamine to $1,000 a pill? It's simply a question of political will. And we have to think about the long game. And when Trump is out of power and when the Democrats are back in Congress, we have a new generation of politicians. We need to educate them about the need for the right to science and the right for public equity and public investment in science to save lives.
I think the scientific community still has lessons to be learned. I think the recent West African Ebola epidemic was a real eye-opener because many of the same issues came up as early in AIDS, but this time it wasn't the community who was demanding, just throw anything at us. It was the physicians. It was the people who were going in to try and treat who said, even though we don't really know whether any of these things work, we just have to give people something, and we're very resistant to the idea of, doing a study to actually see whether something worked. So I think we still have a lot of work to do in making sure that the whole scientific and medical community understands the importance of doing research to actually get answers. Having 100 drugs, this is the key lesson I think that Greg talked about, that the AIDS activists learned very quickly. Having a bunch of drugs in the medicine cabinet when you don't know which one works or if any of them works is useless. You've got to have the research to show you what works. And the people who pushed the 21st Century Cure Act, if you have a child who has a terrible cancer and they've failed all the treatments, you can understand the desire of that person to have access to whatever else is out there. But that just leads ultimately to a medicine cabinet full of drugs that nobody knows what works, and somebody's daughter who's desperately ill 5 years from then is not going to know which one of those drugs to pick out to save their child. So I think we have to keep the medical community in mind as well.
So Donna Milvan said right before this panel that we should have more education on activism in our schools of public health and our schools of medicine. When I come into face-to-face with patient groups, Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, ALS, their rhetoric is the FDA is killing us. It is often that rhetoric. And they don't take the next step that we did in ACT UP and say, okay, how do clinical trials work? Why do we need evidence? What's randomization? All the questions that we had to struggle with because we had drugs that were not working and it was clearly not just a bureaucratic obstacle that was our enemy. We taught ourselves. It's not happening in the context of other diseases, and in fact, drug companies fund 80% of patient groups or more in the U.S. So there's some other sort of education that's happening that we're not a part of, and other people are setting the agenda. So I sort of agree with Donna that we need to sort of embed activism into our training for our future physicians and future public health experts, but also in the undergraduate curriculums, because this is a history that's life and death. It might have been life and death in 1988 and 1987, 1989, but it's life and death now, whether it's tuberculosis or it's ALS. These are serious questions that are not just about historical interest. So it's worth knowing your past so you don't repeat it.
Did you want to continue?
What would you have done? What do you do about the $100,000 a pill drug that works today?
That works?
Yeah. I mean, that's what we're facing today in many instances, right? We have medicines that can work, and the price tag is beyond reach.
So, funny you should ask, because there's a young postgrad student who's applying to medical school now who worked with us in New Haven called Alex Eagleman, and he went and looked at all the drugs approved in Europe and Australia and Canada for a wide variety of diseases, and then looked at the public programs in the US, and then looked which drugs got reimbursed. We reimburse for billions and billions of dollars of drugs that are not reimbursed for by health technology acceptance bodies around the world and other industrialized countries. So we pour a lot of money down the toilet, right? So if a drug works and it's $100,000, let's get the evidence to do it, and let's do the analyses to show that they're cost-effective and worth putting on the market. Right now we have basically weakening regulatory structures for drug approval, and a pay whatever you, basically an open floodgate for reimbursement for drugs that may be a little more than placebos. I do think there are other places around the world that are trying to solve these questions about how much things cost and how effective they are and how much we know about them. The United States seems to be, you said it's the American way. We'll pay as much as you want. We don't need to know if it works. I mean, that's sort of the mantra we've got.
In the 50s, the radical anti-capitalist President Dwight David Eisenhower seized tetracycline using eminent domain for the US military after the Korean War because there was a shortage of tetracycline. The state has the power of eminent domain to come in and walk in and seize a drug by many different means. But to get drug prices down, it would require, I think, three things. One would be Medicaid for all, because Medicaid directors can negotiate drug prices. The second would be to actually look at what it costs to make the drug and what's the delta between the making of the drug and the sales price. The Hep C drugs that cost $84,000 for a 6-week or 8-week course cost about $95 to make. So Medicaid could negotiate those prices. And then the third thing is that there's going to be some drugs that are expensive because they're like, say, monoclonal antibodies, or they're complex proteins that have to be infused. And those are going to be more expensive. And they need to be subjected to rigorous trials, and if they have a cost benefit that's favorable, they should be paid for by the public sector through the Medicaid for All. So I think the drug pricing problem is a solvable, and it would be helpful to have a public sector drug company to help bring down the prices of drugs when there was a predatory manufacturer. But I think it's a soluble problem. I don't know whether it's a soluble problem in the United States.
Where's the activism today on it?
So that's a great question for us to leave with. I think that's exactly the question to leave with, right? What are the challenges and the opportunities for political will and activism today that will change the face of epidemics the way that seize control, the FDA and ACT UP changed the face of the AIDS epidemic 30 years ago today? Please join me in thanking this is a wonderful panel. I'd like to Please join us for a reception afterwards. Josh.
Yes, thank you so much for that really vigorous discussion. I would say that the protest that was seize control of the FDA led to a crisis, and that crisis was what gave opportunities for tremendous policy work and the work of dedicated people within the FDA to work with activists to make a huge difference on HIV. And there are many, many important lessons for us today. I will see you, someone should write a book about that, I think. But anyway, I will see you outside for the reception. Thank you all.